Hello, everyone. This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Melody Nest. Looking for a logo or design for your podcast, radio, band, or creative project? I know I was when I started the podcast, and working with a designer who knew what I was looking for made it easy and convenient. Melody Nest is an upcoming platform connecting producers of all kinds to freelance designers to help them create their branding. Check them out and use offer code TESHER to save 10% off your first order. Again, that is offer code TESHER. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the All Things Interesting podcast. My guest today is Jay Solomon, an award-winning journalist who served as the former chief correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, which he joined in 1998. He is also the author of The Iran Wars, Spy Games, Bank Battles, and the Secret Deals That Reshaped the Middle East. He is currently a fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, where he's an expert on Iran's and North Korea's nuclear programs and weapons proliferation networks in the Middle East. During his distinguished career as a journalist, Solomon was honored by the National Press Club on numerous occasions for his foreign policy and diplomatic reporting. He was also nominated for the Pulitzer Prize on 3 occasions. During our conversation, we cover the current events in the Middle East, the spread of technology in the region, the relationships that shape the geopolitical dynamic, and the influence of North Korea's and Iran's nuclear programs on the world. Enjoy the show. I'm back at it with another episode of the All Things Interesting podcast. Hi, Jay. How are you today?
I'm great. Good to be here.
Glad to have you on the show. So I recently came across one of your articles on the internet talking about a shadow war between Israel and North Korea in regards to North Korea's nuclear program and their investment in a lot of Middle Eastern countries such as Iran and Syria, amongst others, trying to basically spread their technology throughout that region. And one of the articles I actually read recently that was from a year ago mentioned by you that a lot of the technology that the Houthi rebels who are in a conflict with Saudi Arabia came from not only North Korea, but from Iran. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think Yemen's a bit of a complicated story because the Houthis are in a civil war with the central government, which is back in Saudi Arabia. And I think some of the weaponry the Houthis got initially was basically stolen from the government forces. And we know that Yemen as a state definitely purchased missiles and other technologies, machine Kalashnikovs and stuff from the North Korean government before there was a civil war. So I think some of the North Korean equipment that the Houthis got was probably stuff they looted from the central government as part of the civil war. But as this conflict has escalated, they've also been receiving ballistic missile technology from the Iranians, which they've been using to hit everything from the Riyadh airport in Saudi Arabia to other technologies. So it is a good example of how North Korean technology spread, both directly to the Yemeni government and then some of the ballistic missile technologies the Iranians have sent also probably originally came from North Korean technology because that's where Iran's program 20 years or so. So you really can get a sense of just how pervasive North Korea's missile technology is across the Middle East, just because they're much more willing to sell it or share it than other governments, and it's cheap in comparison to the costs that other governments sell this technology with. So yeah, Yemen is a great example. The Houthis are a great example, and right now there's this big debate whether who hit the Saudi oil fields. Was it the Houthis using Iranian technologies, or was it the Iranians directly? And it's obviously that's one of the biggest stories in the world right now.
And it's funny you say that because there were recent comments by Mike Pompeo on September 18th when he was talking to reporters, and he mentioned that they had a high level of confidence that the attack originated from Iran because of, and I quote, As for how we know, the equipment used is unknown to be in the Houthi arsenal. The line attack cruise missiles we have never seen there, and we've seen most everything. So the intelligence community has high confidence that these were not weapons that would have been in possession of the Houthis. That's probably the most important piece of information. So there's a lot of conflicting information going on here as to whether or not it's Iranian technology or it's Houthi technology that they acquired from some other entity, whether it be in the Middle East or strictly from North Korea.
Yeah, I mean, I think in this case, they're pretty sure this technology was Iranian, and they're pretty. There's pretty. I mean, I think they're pretty sure that the strikes came from the north, not from the south. So in this day and age, you would assume it wouldn't be that hard to retrace the line of cruise missile attack, from the origin of the direction where it came from. So yeah, I think it's both the technology, but also the direction from which the drones or the cruise missiles came from, that are the intelligence community is using to basically attribute where these attacks came from.
Well, let's just say that it came from Iran. What kind of repercussions or sort of retaliation would you expect from a country like Saudi Arabia, considering that I think a day or two ago, the U.S. announced that they're sending further troops into Saudi Arabia to bolster their air defenses. Now, in the past, during the Iran-Iraq War, we have seen cases in which North Korea bolstered Iran's air defense systems by the exact same context. Do you think this is going to further engulf the region in a war or escalate the situation if the U.S. in turn sends soldiers there?
I mean, I think I've been a little bit surprised initially that there wasn't a retaliation almost immediately, just because you're striking the major oil infrastructure in the Straits of Hormuz, which is a pretty big deal. And the fact that there has been sort of a cautious response, I think, is telling to the fact that the Iranians have a lot of proxies, whether in Iraq, in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Syria, and they've really worked to build those proxies over the last 10, 20 years. So I think in this situation, if this was 15 or 20 years ago, I don't think there would be much hesitation at all as far as a retaliation of a military type, just because to hit the oil infrastructure of such a major player, what was 5-10% of global output was initially impacted. The fact that there is so much reluctance right now, I think tells you just how effective the Iranians have been at building up this proxy structure across the Middle East. I mean, what it looks like the U.S. and the Saudi response is going to be right now is to fortify the Saudi infrastructure, fortify defenses in the Gulf, and ratchet up even more economic sanctions on Iran. I think the Trump administration is betting that the Iranians have been so devastated by this economic warfare that even if they're pulling off minor attacks, if the U.S. just keeps the financial pressure on, at some point the Iranians are going to blink and come back to the negotiating table and maybe make more concessions on their nuclear program, and more concessions on other fronts. But I think right now you're watching sort of a game of chicken. The U.S. is mounting more financial pressure. The Iranians now apparently are taking more steps on the military front to either disrupt the global energy markets or target American allies. That which pressure mounts more? Does these type of military attacks become so great that the U.S. either engages militarily or says, okay, let's negotiate, or does the financial pressure on Iran get so much that they blink? I think we're watching this kind of cat and mouse game right now, and it's unclear who's going to win.
Yeah, but at the same time, though, I can understand where you're coming from, where countries such as Israel and the U.S. are currently at odds in terms of their Defense Department officials wanting to avoid conflict, but at the same time understanding that there is a sort of a red line that is being crossed by countries such as Iran in terms of their development of certain weapons and inciting proxy conflict through the region.
Yeah.
That said, though, if a country such as Iran is kind of pushed to the brink and forced to use their proxies, don't you think that they're going to receive further technology from countries such as North Korea, or that they are going to incite a larger conflict? I don't know if pressuring a country like that with economic sanctions is necessarily going to lead them to the table. We've seen numerous situations in the past where countries like that, with their back up against the wall, are going to fight instead of just come back to the table. Even if we look at North Korea in the past, dating back to probably the 80s and 90s, the U.S. on multiple attempts have tried to negotiate with them, and in some cases they would receive economic relief in turn for North Korea reducing their nuclear arsenal or developments of their facilities, but covertly they would still continue to do that. And that's something Iran has continued to do as well over the past few decades.
I mean, it is a really difficult question when you look at the North Korean situation, because no one wants a war in Northeast Asia. I think everyone acknowledges how destructive that conflict would be to, Japan, South Korea, obviously North Korea. The problem is the U.S. has tried for about 30 years to negotiate with Iran, with the North Koreans, and essentially every time we've done it, they've been cheating. So it's a real bind, and we had that big agreement in 1994 between the U.S. and the North Koreans, which they turned out to be cheating on. Obama's tenure, they tried to negotiate, and then the North Koreans started shooting off missiles. So it's a very difficult. It's a really difficult dynamic where you don't want military conflict, but at the same time, negotiations often, it's certainly on the North Korean side, has never proven to develop real agreements because they're constantly cheating. I think Iran. Sorry, go ahead.
So what makes you think that Iran isn't going to pull the same strategy that North Korea is pulling? I know that President Trump has differing strategies with North Korea and Iran. On one hand, he is very cordial and has built up a friendship with Kim Jong-un, and with Iran, he is increasing pressure on them. But you can't expect that Iran, considering their past attempts to build up their nuclear facilities and technology, aren't going to do the same thing as the Koreans have, despite being pressured economically by sanctions.
Right. No, I think that the Iranians have probably totally learned from the North Korean playbook, which is, covertly build these type of facilities, get into negotiations, drag it out, continue to develop. I mean, the Iran nuclear agreement of 2015 is so controversial because they did reach a deal, but if you really looked at the terms of that agreement, the Iranians in 10, 15 years are basically going to be allowed legally to develop the infrastructure needed to develop nuclear weapons. That's why it was so controversial. And, since the deal was signed in 2015, they've continued to develop their ballistic missile technology. The Israelis went into Iran and stole these documents, which showed that they continued to warehouse a lot of the testing data and other information they gleaned from their past secret nuclear weapons studies. And even the IAEA, the UN's nuclear watchdog, a couple of weeks ago, stories came out that they had found traces of uranium at undeclared sites inside of Iran. And why would you be doing that if you really had given up your nuclear weapons program? I mean, they overtly have a nuclear program. The weapons side of it has been what's been in dispute. But why would you continue to sort of warehouse data and technology from from past weapons efforts if you'd really given it up. So yeah, it's really does the pressure work? I think from my own reporting, I went to in 2014. I went to Iran for this book I worked on, the Iran Wars, and interviewed senior central bank officials. And I mean, the sense I got from them was that in 2012, 2013, during the last real escalation of sanctions against Iran, they were really on the brink. I mean, the sense I got from this deputy central bank governor is they were worried they weren't going to be able to pay civil servants. Their access to hard currency had really diminished. And then they went into negotiations with the Obama administration. The pressure was relieved, and then eventually they got the nuclear agreement. So, I mean, I think Iran is in real bad shape financially. And you're right. When countries have their backs against the wall, often they do respond, in this case, militarily, which is what the Iranians seem to be doing. But it still does seem like there's a good possibility, I would think, that there probably will be negotiations at some point, just because both sides, I think, understand that an all-out war would be devastating to Iran, would be devastating to the global economy, and this is not something President Trump has really suggested that he wanted to get into, particularly going into an election year.
Right. So I want to go back to that, but I do have to ask, somehow looking back into the 90s or so, I think during the fall of the Soviet Union, North Korea was losing a lot of their financial and technological support due to the collapse. And they were in a situation in which they were becoming heavily impoverished, but they still managed to develop out their nuclear program to such an advanced degree. Why is it that Iran isn't able to do the same, even under strict sanctions and lack of financial capital to do so?
I mean, why were the North Koreans able to advance it even more than the Iranians, basically?
Correct.
It's interesting. I interviewed a lot of IAEA officials for my book and during reporting, and they actually say the North Korean scientists are, from what they've seen, were more advanced. They were trained. Most of their nuclear scientists were trained in the former Soviet Union. I don't think most of the Iranians didn't have that type of training. So the sense I got is that the North Koreans were more advanced, largely just because they had better scientists, better education in the nuclear realm. Is the sense I got, and I also think the Iranians have kind of gone through phases where they're, at some point they were doing secret train, even on just the pure nuclear infrastructure. Forget the weapons side; it's kind of waxed and waned. I don't think the North Koreans ever waxed and waned. I think they were full bore for a long time, because I think they, unlike Iran, I think for the North Koreans, it really is an existential. They saw nuclear technologies as essentially the only way to keep that regime afloat. The South Koreans have gotten so more advanced economically than the North has. So I think it's probably a combination of education and just commitment. And I think the North Koreans have shown that they were basically willing to do anything to get nuclear weapons. I think the Iranians were on a much slower glide path.
Mm-hmm. Now, vocally and publicly, the Iranians have clarified that they have no intention of developing nuclear weapons and that they only want the technology for peaceful purposes.
Correct.
But at the same time, there have been numerous articles and discussions over the fact that both the Koreans and the Iranians have been exchanging technology and research for the past decades over intercontinental ballistic missile technology, as well as the development of nuclear facilities. How does that kind of go together if Iran is vocally saying they're using it for peaceful purposes?
I don't think, honestly, in that story I wrote, we saw I mean, there's really documented evidence of North Korean transferring nuclear technology to Syria. Actual nuclear technologies to Iran is kind of this smoking gun that has not yet really been found. The missile technology is, or the missile cooperation is pretty much indisputable. There's been a lot of evidence of North Korean and Iranian scientists sharing, making trips to other people, to each other's countries. I wasn't able for that article able to find kind of indisputable proof that nuclear technologies, like in Syria, the North was basically building a plutonium producing facility for them when the Israelis bombed it, and that's pretty much indisputable. But that smoking gun has not yet happened on the Iranian side. That said, one of the great mysteries of the Syrian project was, what was Iran's role in that, given how close the Iranian and the Syrian alliance is, because the Syrians did not have a lot of money, so it was the question of who was financing that reactor in Syria, and there's been a question whether the Iranians sort of outsourced that facility to Syria so that they could have access to developing a nuclear weapons program, but outside of its own borders. So that is one of the real interesting mysteries in the Middle East over the last 15 years, and why I wrote so much about that attack on the reactor on Syria, because there's just still so many mysteries tied to it and questions whether Iran was somehow involved in that project.
And even looking back about 10 years or so, Israel was on the verge of striking Iran independently of the U.S. They had, I believe, planes or drones north of Iran doing preparations, and Bibi Netanyahu multiple times would say that Iran is 3 months away from the bomb, they're 3 years away from the bomb, and he would continue to talk about this supposed red line that Iran was crossing. Where do you think this all stemmed for, and is there some validity to this based off your comments?
Yeah, I in my book I did a lot of reporting about how close the Israelis were to attacking. I think 2012 they were doing some long range, they had they were doing like basically exercises with long range bombers, which really freaked out the Obama administration, because as you kind of mentioned, if the Israelis were to strike Iran, the U.S. would probably get sucked into any broader conflict that came out of that. And I don't think it was a coincidence that the U.S., the Obama administration, kind of really aggressively accelerated their efforts to begin negotiations with Iran in 2012. That's when the first secret meetings between Iran and North Korea happened. I think because they wanted a diplomatic route to start to make sure that there wasn't an Israeli effort to bomb it. Yet Netanyahu is I think some of his stuff has been pretty accurate. He did a cartoon at the UN, I forget what year that was, that basically was showing how far along, because I think at the time the Iranians were enriching uranium to 20% purity, which is pretty close to weapons. It's convoluted and complicated, but the from going to 20% enrichment to 90% enrichment is, you've gone a long way. And at that point they were enriching to 20%, and Netanyahu had some big cartoon that basically was showing how close they were to having weapons grade uranium. And that they are, I mean, I think even now, if they wanted to go and totally back out of the nuclear deal and start enriching uranium to weapons grade, they could do that pretty rapidly. And I think, I still think the estimate is that the U.S. estimate was that they would probably be about a year away from accumulating enough weapons grade uranium for one bomb, provided there's nothing being housed secretly. And I was mentioning the IAEA did find, or say they found traces recently of uranium that was traced to this warehouse in Tehran. So I think now Netanyahu has been kind of all over the place over the last 20 or 30 years, but I think there's a pretty good assessment now, and I guess you could say that was one of the good things about the Iran nuclear deal is that there was a pretty much a consensus about how far away they were from potentially having a weapon.
So, how recent would you say that 1 year estimate would be relative to the U.S. recently pulling out from the Iran deal?
I still think the IAEA's. I mean, Iran has started to back out of the deal and have started to accumulate more low enriched uranium. So it's not bomb material yet. But I still think the estimate is probably about the same. I don't think they haven't reverted so far back from their commitments that they could get a bottom, much faster. I still think it's about a year.
Do you think that, considering the economic pressure that the U.S. is putting on Iran, do you think that they themselves would completely back out of the deal as some form of last resort and push their research and development to its limits?
I mean, it's possible. I mean, I still think the nuclear deal was so good for Iran because it basically legalized their ability to have the technology. I was never one who thought the Iranians wanted to test a weapon or start actually overtly developing bombs. My estimation was that they wanted to have the latent ability to have a nuclear weapon, more to deal with their enemies in the region or rivals in the region, whether it's Saudi Arabia or Turkey, and I guess Israel to some extent. But if you really trace the Iranian history, their real threat is Saudi Arabia. I mean, that's the enemy.
Can you dive into that history a bit between Iran and Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back all the way to just the split in Islam between Sunni and Shia, which goes all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad. That's a long time away. But as those two sects evolved over the millennia, Iran eventually became the power behind the Shia brand of Islam, and the Saudis with the two holy mosques and the Mecca and Medina are the custodian of basically Sunni Islam. So the tension is definitely religious, and it's also strategic. Iran still sees themselves as the biggest power in the Middle East. The Persian Empire stretched all the way to the Mediterranean, basically, and all the way to the Caspian, and they still, even the Shah saw Iran as the dominant player in the region. The Saudis, as the largest Sunni power, have always pushed back against that, and the real tension, as you probably know, is the Iran-Iraq War from 80 to 88. I mean, that was Saddam Hussein and Iraq. I mean, Saddam was a Sunni leader backed by Saudi Arabia. So, I mean, that conflict was really a case of a similar type of dynamic where you had the Shia power fighting, in that case, Saddam Hussein, but he was completely backed financially and military by the other Sunni Arab states, and at that time, some of the Western countries as well. So those tensions have gone back for a long time, and the irony of a lot of this is a lot of what the U.S. administrations have done in recent decades, and it's not just Trump, it was Obama and Bush in a lot of ways, has really empowered Iran. Bush got rid of the Taliban in Afghanistan and Saddam in Iraq, which really empowered Iran to move into rivaling countries. Much, in Iraq right now, they're the Shia, almost most of the Shias that are the militia, the Shia militias that have been developed inside of Iraq report more to Iran than they do to their own government. So Iran really has expanded its reach in recent years, and I think that one of the biggest criticisms, obviously, of Bush was, how did you invade Iraq and overthrow Saddam and not realize that you were going to completely empower the Iranians? And then with the Obama administration, they saw Iran sending in literally tens of thousands of militia into Syria to support to support Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and his unbelievably, essentially ethnic cleansing of the Sunnis of Syria, and the Iranians backed all of this. And during the Obama administration, they decided essentially not to do anything. They sort of backed down and decided not to confront what Iran was doing inside of Syria. So over the past 20, 30 years, the Iranians have been expanding their region and their power, and they can thank successive U.S. governments in a lot of ways for helping them out.
Do you think things would have been different if during the Iran-Iraq war, the U.S. had provided military aid to Iran? I know from a bunch of articles I read that the U.S. did not support Iran during that war, and instead they had to become reliant on North Korea, which paved the way for North Korea technology to be spread out within the Middle East and to allow Iran to not only advance their technologies, but like you said, during the recent wars, Iran was able to increase their presence via proxies and rebel groups, not only within Iraq, but spreading all the way northwest into Syria, which has become even more of a threat to Israel itself.
I mean, the Iran-Iraq war was a very strange time because the Shah had fallen in '79, and Iran really was the U.S.'s pretty much. I mean, we also obviously had our alliance with Israel, but Iran under the Shah was one of the U.S.'s closest allies in the world, and they had bought more weapons from the United States almost than any other country before 1980. And it was kind of a. You're right. At first, Saddam Hussein invaded in 1980. We had an arms embargo on Iran, in part because of the taking of the American hostages, the diplomats in Tehran, and that the legacy of that, the U.S. wasn't going to sell arms to Iran, and we basically got most of our allies not to either. And you're right, the North Koreans stepped in. Although one of the strangest interludes in foreign policy in the last couple of decades was the Iran-Contra scandal, where Reagan did try to sell weapons to Iran, essentially against the U.S. laws, but they did sell some missile technologies to Iran in an attempt to get American hostages back. So in some ways, the U.S. played both sides during the Iran-Iraq war, supporting Saddam at times, and then through Reagan, through the Iran-Contra scandals, selling weapons to Iran. So, I don't know. I think it was a really tumultuous time in American foreign policy because you had such a close ally in the Shah suddenly disappearing and this really radical Islamist government coming to power in Tehran. And I think initially the hope was that these guys, it couldn't last, that the revolution would kind of subside. But then if you track some of the other stuff, you remember in 1983, the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut, Lebanon, was blown up, killing 241 Marines. And, we traced that back to Iran. So it was, during the Iran-Iraq war, it was very hard for the Americans to sort of try to create any strategic, cooperation or alliance with Iran when their terrorist proxies were targeting American soldiers. It was, I think it was really shocking to the Reagan administration just how violent and radical the new Iranian government was.
And in many ways, that, in my eyes at least, one of the deterrents that Iran is currently showing when it comes to preventing the U.S. from imposing greater military might against them. They have proxies within South America, within Lebanon, within Palestine, within Syria, within Yemen. And it just goes to show that even if Iran is attacked in any way, that the repercussions are going to be severe. There have been numerous reports that they even infiltrated the U.S. in many ways through targeting certain structures and certain civilian areas, although there have been reports of Lebanese operatives being arrested in the U.S. for those. That's
Yeah, I mean,
go ahead.
it's. I think if you really look at the history of the U.S.-Iran conflict, and I know there's a lot of backbiting in Washington that the U.S. is, too hard on Iran. They're warmongers here. I think if you really look at the history of the U.S.-Iranian situation since the '79 revolution, the Americans have shown an incredible amount of restraint. I mean, yeah, you take the American embassy essentially hostage in Iran. There was an attempt to rescue them, but there was no military strikes on Iran. You had, like I was mentioning, these attacks. Before 9/11, the bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut was the largest terrorist attack against the Americans in our history, and there was no military retaliation against Iran, even though you had like former Secretary of State George Shultz now saying that was if you want to look back at the original sin in a lot of ways, the Iranians and their proxies bombed the American embassy and the Marine barracks in Beirut, and rather than us retaliating, we pulled the Marines out of Lebanon. So a lot of people, like Schultz, I've interviewed Schultz before, you think that really empowered Iran to believe that, this type of proxy warfare, terrorism, it works. And, if you draw that even further back, there was during the Clinton administration, there was the bombing of the Khobar Towers, this oil installation in Saudi that killed a lot of Americans. And then during the U.S. war in Iraq, the second Gulf War, the U.S. could totally trace the IEDs that were coming into Iraq straight into Iran. And there was a lot of pressure, a lot of for retaliation. I've interviewed a lot of senior military officials who wanted to retaliate against Iran for their supplying of all these weaponry to the militias that were targeting Americans, and that never happened. So, yeah, I think the Iranians have been incredibly successful at using these types of militias to inflict pain on us, and I think that is why there's so much reluctance, wariness on either our side or even the Saudi side to respond militarily to what was a pretty brazen attack a couple of weeks ago. And yeah, maybe the intel will show that it really was the Houthis, but even if it was the Houthis, that weaponry almost certainly came, at least in part, from Iran. So I think Iran militarily really has have used a weak hand to become quite strong in the region.
But at the same time, you got to ask yourself, despite the U.S. not retaliating in any way, they still, over the past decade, have built military bases surrounding Iran, whether it be in Iraq, whether it be in United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia, or even Afghanistan. They have been building their presence within the region surrounding Iran. And even further to that, they may not have directly attacked Iran or retaliated militarily. They have, though, used cyber warfare to damage their infrastructure or to damage the research and development of their technologies, as seen by their most recent attacks back in June after the U.S. drone was knocked out of the air, I believe, on the border of Iran. There's some complexities with that situation as to whether it was in Iranian territory or not. But even going back even further, in 2007, the U.S. and Israel partnered to develop a cyber attack called Stuxnet to damage Iran's nuclear facilities, their centrifuges to be specific. So despite there not being any overt conflict, they still are covertly retaliating against Iran.
Oh, for sure. And I think in reality that the economic warfare that was really started as far as our military presence in the region, it's kind of waxed and waned. I mean, we had a huge bases in Saudi Arabia at one point, and then the Saudis kind of didn't want us there, and we moved a lot of it to either Qatar or UAE or other places. So our military presence, as far as trying to encircle Iran or respond to Iran, that's been pretty constant since over the last few decades. So it has kind of waxed and waned depending on how much tension is. But yeah, I think whether it's the cyber warfare, and I think the financial warfare is the U.S. kind of revolutionized. I would say in 2006, 2005, how to really execute financial warfare. In the past, certainly with Saddam Hussein, it was, you pass some UN resolutions and countries are just banned from doing business with, in that case, with Iraq or others with South Africa. But certainly in the Iraqi situation, there was a heck of a lot of cheating going on. And under the Bush administration, the Treasury Department said, hey, we can basically use financial warfare through the dollar and that's what you've seen over the last decade or so, setting up sanctions, which basically told foreign companies or foreign countries, you can keep doing business with Iran if you want to, but if you do, you're going to get sanctioned and you're going to lose access to the U.S. dollar. So they did change the way sanctions were imposed, and I mean it's been incredible. If you look, I think Iran's oil exports now are down from at their height they were at about, I think, 3 million barrels a day. They were usually number 2 or number 3 within OPEC as far as being the world's one of the world's largest oil suppliers. Now they're down below 500,000. I've even heard numbers down as low as like 100,000. So, yeah, you're talking about asymmetrical warfare or non-military warfare. There's definitely the cyber stuff, but I would argue it's the financial warfare that's had the biggest impact, and that's why Iran is retaliating the way they are. It's, I think, financially, and I was telling you when I went there in 2014 to interview central bank figures, they really were on the ropes financially, and I think they're back in that place again. And that's why you see them taking what are unbelievably risky moves, apparently, by striking, the oil fields of their neighbor.
Recently, China announced a very strong investment into Iran. And I forgot the exact figure, but it was in the tens of billions of dollars. And the purpose of that investment was to create further infrastructure in Iran's oil fields, as well as into developing pipelines into China. Now, I'm not sure what the political limitations or ramifications of that are, but in some ways, you got to ask yourself if this is a way to bypass U.S. financial sanctions on Iran when it comes to allowing them to export their oil to countries such as China or any other countries within that region.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure if that type of investment, I'm almost certain would be in violation of U.S. sanctions if they wanted to, if they really were going to impose them. And the French have been talking in recent weeks of trying to issue a $15 billion line of credit to Iran. And Trump, to be honest, sounded almost, before this attack on the oil field, sounded almost open to that idea, which would be a pretty big reversal from him. And I still think there are some in Iran, probably with the advice of some Europeans, that are being told, look how Trump responded to North Korea. If you go meet with him and try to be nice, you can completely sway him, and maybe you should try that same course. And I think I certainly was starting to believe that the Iranians might actually sit down with Trump at the UN General Assembly, which starts next week. I mean, I thought that might happen, but then this oil attack happened, so it seems like they've taken another track. But it is, yeah, the kind of the high stakes of this type of financial warfare is that you don't want to be exposed. In the past, even the Chinese, their companies know that if they want to do business internationally, you have to do it in dollars. The dollar is still the world's currency, and the Chinese financial system, I think most people know, is pretty, despite their economy, is still pretty weak. So in the past, the Chinese have been reluctant to really test or willing to sanction them. But, things change, and our relations with China aren't so good either. So they might be willing to test Trump more than they have in the past as far as doing business with Iran and know that they might be sanctioned.
Now, I want to jump a bit into North Korea as they're kind of a central focal point of this discussion. But before doing that, I have to ask, how do you think the current situation is going to play out in the coming months, if you were to guess?
With the Iranian situation?
Yep, correct.
I mean, my gut is that the Iranians probably have a pretty strong sense that Trump won't get reelected. I mean, I think a lot of this is tied. I think certainly the Europeans and even some of maybe the Obama administration officials who've developed relationships with the Iranian foreign minister have been saying, look, Trump's in trouble. Just wait him out. We'll try to help you financially, wait it out, and then we'll return to the nuclear deal and everything will be fine. My still gut is that the Iranians are still sort of playing a game of escalation and then sometimes talking about diplomacy with the belief that they can wait Trump out another 18 months. So my gut still is that you might see this type of escalation. You know, you might see more rounds of that, but my still gut is that despite the severity of some of these attacks, they're going to kind of wait this until our election cycle to see if Trump isn't, with the hope that Trump isn't reelected, and that then the pressure will be removed. That's still my greatest. That's, if I had to bet, I would bet that you'll see some spikes in tension, but you won't see an all-out war. But, people miscalculate. I don't think anyone thought the Iranians were going to strike directly into into Saudi Arabia's oil fields. And even if it's not proven that they did it directly, if the Houthis did it, they still probably only did it under the orders of the Iranians. So that's a pretty big escalation. And I think it's driven by the fact that their economy is in such bad shape.
Right. And I mean, the situation seems to be escalating bit by bit,
yep,
despite it being a tit-for-tat game of chicken that's going on in the Middle East currently. But on the note of diplomacy, I kind of want to shift things into North Korea. Now, dating back as far as the 80s, diplomacy with North Korea has been a continued struggle, as you may know. Publicly, North Korea states that their intentions have been of fueling peace and of nuclear disarmament along the Korean Peninsula. But secretly, they've continued to develop their nuclear program and their missile program, which has resulted in an ebb and flow of relations, not only with the South Koreans, but with the United States as well. Why do you think the U.S. continues to negotiate with North Koreans, knowing full well that development will continue in the background?
It's just because the cost of war will be so high. I mean, we were talking earlier about how the Iranians have developed these proxies, which are a deterrent. The North Koreans would absolutely flatten Seoul, South Korea, within hours if we had launched a major military strike, and they'd almost certainly strike Japan as well. So it's just the cost of a conflict is too high. And now it only gets, I've heard even kind of dovish former U.S. diplomats saying, God, it was a real mistake, probably in retrospect, not to have attacked North Korea's nuclear infrastructure in the early 90s when they didn't develop the capabilities that they have. Even if there was a pretty big retaliation and death toll in South Korea in the early 90s, you could argue, even from a humanitarian standpoint, you would have stopped their nuclear program then. I think there was a famine. The North Koreans so mismanaged their country in the mid-90s. There was a famine that left millions dead. So if they had taken military action in the early 90s, you might have averted that sanction and the numbers of deaths that happened in North Korea through famine, and you would have cut off that nuclear supply chain earlier. But I just think always it's that the cost of that type of conflict would be so high. I mean, we went into Libya to take out Gaddafi because the guy didn't really have any capabilities to target us. but the North Koreans do, and I think that's why you've seen this just endless cycle of provocation by North Korea, threats from the U.S., but then ultimately nothing happening because the cost of war is so high.
So we know Trump has attempted to negotiate with both the Iranians and the Koreans, and in different fashions ultimately. Do you think that Trump's negotiation and diplomatic strategy will differ from his predecessors, such as Obama, Bush, and Bush Sr., when it comes to North Korea's missile program? And do you think that there will be some level of success with that?
Nah, not really. I think the North Koreans have been smart. I think they've kind of gamed it out. I mean, there was a lot of bluster in the first months of the Trump administration, with the Trump making really strong threats against North Korea, and the North Koreans. I mean, the North Koreans were testing missiles and nukes constantly. It was really dangerous. I mean, in some ways, even the harshest. When Trump replaced Obama's meetings with Trump in the transition were the biggest threat you're going to face is North Korea, and there's a real chance for war. So no matter how cynical one might be about President Trump, you could say that he has avoided a conflict, and they have stopped testing nuclear weapons. But I still think there's not going to be any real movement towards dismantling North Korea's nuclear program. I think they're just not going to do that. So he'll probably take some criticism for that you got sucked into some diplomatic path by the North Koreans, by Kim Jong-un, just to kind of draw out the clock. But when people were really concerned about a war too, that hasn't happened. But I wouldn't hold my breath for any dramatic diplomacy. No.
So interestingly enough, going back to the discussion on cyber warfare, in 2017, there was a New York Times article which discussed efforts by the U.S. to disrupt North Korean advancements by way of cyber attacks, which resulted in numerous failed missile tests. This is very similar to the U.S.-Israeli cyber attack on Iran using Stuxnet. Do you think there's a complete shift over from diplomacy and military posturing by the U.S. to a more covert strategy reliant on disrupting R&D to be an effective deterrent of North Korea's missile program?
Yeah, those stories were pretty controversial at the times, because I think a lot of experts didn't really believe it. That they said, look, developing long-range ballistic missiles is a difficult prospect, and there's always failures. But if you look at the path of North Korea, they've actually been pretty successful recently. So I think there was some pretty serious questions whether cyber attacks really had that much of an impact on North Korea's missile program. And even with the Iranian situation, there was the Stuxnet attack blew up centrifuge machines by making them go too fast. But even there, the Iranians, once they got wind of it, took them offline, and we were able to replace those centrifuges pretty quickly. So I think there are pretty strong limitations to just how much cyber warfare, how much it can impact these missile and nuclear programs, even if they do have kind of tactical successes here and there. As far as long term, in both the North Korean and the Iranian situation, they seem to have been able to overcome those operations pretty quickly.
Let's just say, for example, that North Korea is headstrong about developing not only their nuclear arsenal, but the delivery systems as well to reach other continents such as the U.S.
Yep.
Do you think that they are strictly using this as a deterrent to foreign pressure, or do you think they do have some intention of using it offensively against the U.S. or any of its regional allies?
I mean, I think the scary thing about North Korea is if you really look at their doctrine, I still think their basic strategy is to drive a wedge between the South Koreans and the U.S. And
how so?
Well, like you could almost see it now. If they develop the ability to hit us with long-range nukes, are we really going to go in and defend South Korea if the North Koreans try to invade? Probably not, or there'd be a lot more thinking about it. So if you study their doctrine, I think their doctrine is develop the capabilities to deter America, drive a wedge between the South Koreans and the Americans, and then at some point take over the whole peninsula. I still think that ultimately is their doctrine. I don't think it's
in
ever
a military fashion, though. You mean take over it, or force the Koreans to come to the table to unify the Korean peninsula?
Yeah, a unification on their terms, basically. Whether that's a military offensive or you'd have them so under so much military coercion that they kind of agree to some sort of unification on softer term. I mean, it sounds crazy.
It does. Do you think the U.S. would accept that?
No, but at the same time, when I was based in Korea in the early 2000s, the idea that North Korea would have atomic weapons, almost hydrogen bombs, and the capability to deliver them to the U.S. was probably seen as a joke. And here we are 20 years later, and they're almost there. I mean, no one really took it seriously, I don't think, or not seriously enough. Probably because, there's this image of North Korea as this kind of cartoonish type country. But the fact that they've developed the capabilities that they have, you just can't. Last year, 2 years ago, he assassinated his brother-in-law in Malaysia using VX. I mean, a nerve agent in a foreign country. You can't really rule anything out with these guys. And I still think, Kim Jong-un is kind of seen as the most like Kim Il-sung, his grandfather.
The founder of the North Korean.
The founder of North Korea.
Yeah.
And, I think he's seen as a much more effective leader than his father as far as, setting objectives in this case and delivering them. So, I mean, I think if you really got to the end of the day, I still think that North Korea's strategy is unification on their terms. And a key part of that is being able to deter the United States, threaten the United States, so they're either going to leave the Korean peninsula or just not intervene if there is some sort of conflict.
We know that North Korea and China have some sort of relationship, whether it be very positive or very rocky in some circumstances, which has threatened China's ability to, in some ways, puppeteer North Korea. What I'm curious to know is, do you think is there a chance that North Korea could go against China? And if so, wouldn't this lead to the U.S. implementing nuclear weapons on the peninsula or within Japan?
I mean, I still think, despite what other bumps in the road there are between North Korea and the Chinese, ultimately, the Chinese see North Korea in ways that Iran sees Hezbollah, i.e., they're a proxy that threatens the U.S. and its allies and keeps them off balance. I mean, I covered and studied enough of the North Korean nuclear program that it's just inconceivable to me that the Chinese don't have a pretty good sense of what the North Koreans are developing, because so much of it comes through China. I mean, almost all the North Korean front companies operate through China. The technologies come through China. It's just, I remember last year or 2 years ago that there was a North Korean, the UN caught a North Korean diplomat trying to sell, I think it was polonium, working out of the North Korean embassy in China and doing it on the internet. I mean, it's just inconceivable that the Chinese don't have a pretty good sense what the North Koreans are up to and are cool on it with it to an extent, because it keeps the Americans bogged down. It keeps the Japanese bogged down. They're a useful deterrent, or even worse than a deterrent, a useful offensive ally to target or at least keep the Americans and their friends bogged down.
So we both know that North Korea and Iran pose a substantial threat to their respective regions and possibly outside those regions. Their nuclear programs are contentious in the news as of late, but which do you think poses a greater threat to not only regional stability, but to world stability?
North Korea or Iran?
Mm-hmm.
God, I mean, it's similar. I think probably the Iranian situation, just because the Iranians are, I mean, the North Koreans for a time, like, they were funding proxy groups or very active outside of their borders. And, I mentioned that attack in Malaysia. They still do it to some extent. But they never developed this type of, kind of network of, I mean, the Iranians call it the axis of resistance, which includes the Syrians, it includes Hezbollah, the Houthi rebels. But I guess I'd look at it in a little bit of a different way. When I talked about that reactor in Syria, what's so alarming is how all of these bad guys really, they do cooperate. They do. The Iranians call the axis of resistance, and people just think of the Middle East, but I would argue that the North Koreans are part of that axis of resistance. The Venezuelans are part of that axis of resistance. The Chinese and the Russians are in some ways as well. So I think if the Iranians get nuclear weapons, it's dangerous because it's a bigger phenomenon. It's this anti-Western bloc, this resistance bloc, whatever you want to call it, working in a lot of ways in concert that is overturning kind of the Western model that was developed. And that's pretty dangerous. So whether it's Iran or North Korea, I think they seem to be, I mentioned in that article that the Israelis watched some of these tests and think the Iranians and the North Koreans are basically sequencing their testing and learning from each other. So it's sort of like they're developing this stuff in tandem. And that's just, it's incredibly dangerous.
On that note, going back many decades, Israel instituted a doctrine called the Begin Doctrine, which stated that no Israeli government could allow its regional enemies to possess weapons of mass destruction. Now, we know that North Korea has become incredibly involved in the development of nuclear arms and missiles within the Middle East. Do you think that Israel could take extreme steps to prevent the disbursement of nuclear weapons or missiles sooner than the U.S. would in the coming future?
I mean, they did. Yeah.
I was going to say, do you think that this could involve North Korea in some ways?
Well, I mean, they did attack the reactor and blow it up in Syria in 2007. And that did involve North Koreans. They killed North Koreans. There were definitely North Koreans at that site that were killed. So, yeah, I mean, the Israelis have acted twice. They blew up the reactor in Iraq, the Osirak reactor in Iraq in 1981, right. And then they blew up the reactor in Syria in 2007. So they've shown they're willing to act, and the attack in Syria definitely did kill North Koreans. Would they? I'm skeptical the Israelis would launch operations, in Asia. I mean, there were rumors, as I mentioned in that article I wrote, that there was a huge explosion of a North Korean train in 2004, and allegedly there were Syrian military types on the train, and that the skepticism or the sense was that train was moving North Korean missile parts to Syria, and the Israelis struck it. Mm-hmm. I was never able to confirm that, but that would have been a pretty extreme example of the Israelis taking actions way away from its borders to stop that type of transfer, which you mentioned.
There has been diplomacy attempts, though, between Israel and North Korea in the late 90s to stem the delivery of missiles and parts over to Iran, I believe, and its other regional partners. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was basically just a flash. It was basically extortion. Give us $1 billion and we'll stop selling this stuff. And it didn't happen largely because maybe the Israelis would have done it if they weren't one of our closest allies, but the Americans were saying, don't do it. Mm-hmm. You're getting extorted. Let us deal with it. And there's buyer's remorse in Israelis in Israel because they said, well, we did kind of step back and hope the Americans would stop these missile transfers, and they never did. But yeah, I still think, if they're going to take more military action, it's most likely against Iran as far as that. But even like, as I mentioned in the article, the North Koreans have been pretty central to building up Assad's chemical weapons program inside Syria. And, the Israelis have been increasingly striking Syria and hitting Iranian targets, Syrian targets, Hezbollah targets. I wouldn't be surprised if they're hitting North Koreans. Maybe they don't know they are, but there are definitely North Korean military advisors deployed in Syria, so there's definitely a possibility that they're getting hit as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I'm still skeptical the Israelis would hit North Korea itself, but they've hit a lot of these countries. A couple years ago, they were hitting Sudan. I don't know if you remember that.
I do not remember that, actually.
They had a pretty good sense of how Iran was shipping weapons to Hamas through. These weapons would come through Sudan and then up into Egypt and then eventually into the Gaza Strip. And there were some bombings of in Sudan of convoys. And just in recent weeks, months, they've been hitting Iraq. They've been hitting targets inside of Iraq. Which were either Iranian targets or Iranian allied targets. So they are increasingly hitting far from shores to try to cut off the weapons flow and what they worry about, which is kind of a land bridge being established between Iran through Iraq through Syria onto their border, and that you can see that that's kind of happening.
Now, it's interesting you say that because Saudi Arabia has been a primary antagonist of Iran. Both Israel and Saudi Arabia don't have any public or overt relationship, but behind the scenes there have been numerous studies and discussions over the fact that Israel and Saudi Arabia do collaborate on their military efforts against Iran. Do you think that the current events are going to strengthen that relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and do you think that could lead to further action between the two in collaboration with one another to strike, whether it be Iraqi forces, Iranian forces, or Yemen forces in the region?
Yeah, I do think that's. I mean, in my own reporting, I know the Israelis were, as I was mentioning, the Israelis have pretty good intel, even down into, into the Straits of Hormuz, even into North Africa. And what I've reported is that Israelis have shared intel with the Saudis and the UAE as far as weapon shipments from Iran into Yemen to the Houthis. So there's been intelligence sharing on that level, and Israel is a very advanced country as far as developing high tech, and there's a lot of sales of high tech, whether it's software, data mining capabilities, and types of technologies that are used for surveillance. So it's happening, but as this conflict heats up even more, I think you'll see the issue of the Palestinian issue has really kind of diminished in the eyes of the as far as the Saudis and the Arabs, as far as how much where they prioritize that issue. Iran is issue number one, and their closest, one of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. In that case, it's really true. And
Right.
The fact that it looks like Netanyahu is probably leaving office, and a general is going to likely come in who's probably not that much more dovish, but he might be a little bit more palatable to the Arabs as far as his rhetoric. That might actually help even strengthen it further if the new president or the new prime minister is not Netanyahu, and even if at least takes a rhetorically softer line to the Arabs and to the Palestinians in particular, that also might underpin greater cooperation. I think that the UAE is hosting the World's Fair soon, and there's going to be the Israelis are allowed to go there. So I mean, this stuff is happening. This rapprochement is happening.
Right. So I mean, it's still interesting to see how the geopolitical events are playing out. But on that note, I kind of want to shift over to asking a couple of community questions. In some of my episodes, I like to get the community involved, have them provide their questions to ask. And I want to just pose a couple of quick questions to you from some community members.
Sure.
So, question number one. Are you familiar with Kenneth Walt's case for the Iranian nuke? And if so, what are your thoughts on Iran being a stabilizing force in the region?
I think I generally know, which is, if they have a nuclear weapon, the Israelis have nuclear weapons, they'll offset each other and you'll have some sort of deterrence. I don't believe that, because I don't really think the Iranians view Israel really as their existential threat. I think they see their biggest threat as Saudi Arabia. And one of my biggest criticisms of the Iran nuclear deal was that the U.S. and the world powers basically said, yes, Iran should have the ability to enrich uranium and make nuclear fuel, even on an industrial scale. So if that's the case, how could you then look to Saudi Arabia and say, well, you can't develop the same capabilities, even though you're our ally, you're not an enemy like Iran, you can't have that technology. I think it puts the genie out of the bottle, and I don't see Iran as a stable force. They're a revolutionary force that really believes that they should export their type of revolution and their philosophy around the globe. And if they were kind of a status quo player, maybe that would be different. But I don't see how them having nuclear weapons would be a stabilizing force. I don't see it.
And a follow-up question to that is, how might other countries follow suit? Because Israel's known to have nuclear weapons, and Pakistan as well as India are known to have nuclear weapons. The concern is that if Iran was to get nuclear weapons to become a stabilizing force, that would lead to the UAE and Saudi Arabia both pursuing nuclear weapons as well.
And Turkey and Egypt. No, already the Saudis have been talking about, we want to develop a nuclear program, and we want to have the technology to enrich uranium. And, you can have a full-blown nuclear power industry and just buy the uranium from someone else. You don't need to develop it yourself. That was always the argument that the U.S. normally made, which was, Iran, sure, you can have a nuclear power program, just you can get the uranium, the nuclear fuel from the IAEA or some international fuel bank, or from the Russians. You don't need to develop it yourselves. And the Iranians would always say, no, we do need it. And even though economically they don't, and they still, they got it, I think, because they want to have a latent weapons program. So yeah, I think the Saudis have already been talking about this. The UAE is building reactors as we speak. The Egyptians and the Turks have talked about it. Yeah, it's a very dangerous situation, and I think the genie's out of the bottle, and how do you get it back in? It's really hard.
So question number 2, and this is kind of an interesting question. I'm hoping you can kind of decipher it as well. But what's the similarity between North Korea and Iran beyond being bugbears for Bush? Shouldn't they both belong to entirely separate policies based on their regions?
Well, I think, that the axis of evil or whatever. I mean, I think there is the truth that these countries do act, even if they're totally apart geographically. One's a Marxist country and the other's an Islamist country. They do they act, they coordinate, they ally themselves with each other. They are different policies, because in North Korea, you're basically dealing with the Chinese, and it's a policy completely tied to China. North Korea is Iran is a little bit more divorced from that. But yeah, the more I've studied this stuff, it is amazing how much these countries, the kind of the evil, nasty rogue regimes, do coordinate and cooperate with each other.
Is it fair to say that the Iraq War was a huge boon for Iran? And to elaborate on that, Iran wishes to be a regional hegemon, spreading its ideology and influence through MENA, which is the Middle East and North Africa. Prior to the Iraq War, Saddam limited the amount of influence Iran could have over Iraq, despite the Shia majority that existed in Iraq. The current government seems much closer to Iran in comparison.
Yeah, I mean, I had a whole chapter in my book about this that, yeah, it just, Iraq was, before the war, was ruled by a Sunni strongman, and the Shia were, I forgot what the Shia population in Iraq, it's 60 or 70%, even higher, and the Sunnis are much lower. So it didn't take a rocket scientist to realize that if you got rid of Saddam, the Shia powers would be much strengthened. And how would that? I think that the Bush crowd argued that, yeah, the Shia will become more powerful in Iraq, but they're going to, they're not going to want to follow the Iranian line. They're going to want to be sort of more secular, and the Iranians won't have that much influence. But that did turn out to be true. The Iranians have been masterful of sort of subverting the Iraqi state and setting up all these similar type of militias. So yeah, without a doubt, the U.S., the Bush administration's war against Iraq strengthened Iran for sure. I guess I don't think Saddam Hussein was kind of sustainable. The guy was such a tyrant; he wasn't going to be able to stay in power forever. Mm-hmm. And when he eventually fell, I think the dynamic that the Shia in Iraq would be empowered, and that could potentially be to Iran's advantage, was always going to be there. But yeah, I think it's unquestionable that the Iraq War was a kind of a boon for the Iranians.
What is the scope of operations of Turkish and Iranian forces, officially or unofficially, within the borders of Iraq? Do these forces overlap or impinge on each other? And what is the degree of hostility? How can Iranian and Turkish goals be summarized with regards to Iraq?
Inside of Iraq, I mean, the Iranians and the Turks are not, they're pretty, opposed in a lot of ways. The Iraqis, I mean, the main efforts the Turks have done is to try to fight ISIS, and that's sort of to Iran's support. But I don't think they've ever really coordinated. What I found most kind of alarming during the Iraq War was how you basically had the Iranians and the Syrians backing opposing forces in a civil war to basically sabotage the U.S. operation there. It was pretty blatant how the Syrians, despite the Assad regime in Syria being nominally Shia and secular, they would actively assist Al-Qaeda fighters going into Iraq from Yemen or from other countries to fight the Americans. And on the other side, you had the Iranians supporting the Shia militias that were fighting the Americans, and the Shias and the Al-Qaeda guys were fighting each other. So they were masterful of basically supporting opposing sides of a civil war. The Turks, I don't see them as much of a player in there as the Syrians and the Iranians were.
And then the last question, which might be kind of a reiteration of our prior discussion, but does Iran or North Korea have any incentive to use their nukes if they happen to have them and their respective delivery systems?
Yeah, I mean, I think North Korea is such kind of a cultish, crazed regime that if they really thought that that they might fall, I could see them using nuclear weapons in sort of a desperate attempt to maintain their power. I wouldn't put that past them. The Iranians, I mean, I don't think I've never viewed that. I've viewed them as more of a kind of a rational actor than the North Koreans. But I guess if they ever developed them and they really believed that their, regime was under threat, maybe they could use them. But I'd be more worried about the North Koreans.
Well, Jay, it's been an absolute pleasure. But before we go, I wanted to quickly talk about your book, The Iran Wars, that came out in 2016. Could you share a bit of information on that book you wrote to the listeners?
Yeah, I mean, it was an interesting book because I had been a foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal for a long time, and then moved back to the U.S. in around 2006. And at that time, the Iraq War was still going on, and then the Afghanistan War was still going on. And I was kind of amazed that even though you had these two conflicts, the common denominator in a lot of ways was Iran, because the Iranians they had so much influence inside of Iraq, and they had influence inside of Afghanistan. And then it was around that time that the concern about Iran's nuclear program really started to grow. So I initially had an idea called the Third War, which I was going to say, despite the fact that Iraq and Afghanistan are visibly this conflict, in reality, the biggest conflict being waged right now are to try to restrain Iran. And then, when Obama came in, talking to Obama administration officials, they would always describe Iran as kind of the country that tied together so much. It was, if you wanted to try to end the Arab-Israeli conflict, Iran was going to be a great essential player. If you're going to try to stabilize Syria, Iran. If you wanted to stabilize Iraq, Afghanistan. So it wasn't a surprise to me that President Obama, within kind of weeks of taking office, started to send feelers and secret communications to Iran to try to start negotiations, and then they actually started secret talks in 2012. So it was the centrality of Iran to so many different foreign policy issues that made me think there would be a great book in writing about that. And I think I bet right, because even after the Obama administration and the nuclear deal, this issue of Iran continues to be kind of in a lot of ways the central national security issue on the table.
And so for those listeners out there who are interested in checking out the book, learning more about you, or even contacting you, they can find you at www.j-solomon.com and on Twitter at jsolomon. So, Jay, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show today. It's really been an interesting conversation. Thank you again.
Thanks a lot, and let's keep in touch.